While it's true that the military-industrial complex have interests and they do try to impact the body politic, there are other interests at play. For the Ukrainian people, if you were to ask them why they are fighting for, they're not fighting for the military-industrial complex. No. They're fighting for it because they want to defend their homes, they want to defend their villages, and they want to liberate the towns and villages that were taken over by an imperial occupying force. And from their perspective, asking them why they're fighting, they can give you a million different reasons, whether it's Protestants saying that they want to fight against religious persecution. And I know many people in the Ukrainian Protestant community, whether it's people who have farms or villages and towns in occupied territory that they were displaced from. My good friend Bogdan, he was displaced from Donetsk. And the main reason he supports continuing the fight against the Russians is because he has no home to return to, along with millions of other Ukrainians. And I think that when it comes to Ukraine specifically, we have been generally reconciliatory with Ukrainians for about with the Russians for about 8 to 9 years, and that policy taken by both the Obama and Trump and even early Biden administration, I think, has been largely a failure. And I think it's time to let the Ukrainians take point over the struggle for their own freedom, both for American security interests, European security interests, and their own freedom, which I think it is also a moral struggle.
Yeah. I mean, don't look at, I mean, this is something that I've been, for me, it isn't just about the military industrial complex. There's a very long history here. It doesn't go back to Russia invading Ukraine, whenever that was 2 years ago, whenever that was. It goes out, right. It goes way before that. And there's been a history there as to between the people within Ukraine, people that are in Eastern Ukraine. They've been having their own issues. Like, I know enough to know that I don't know enough about it, and it is very complicated. Mm-hmm. But what I do know, to me, is that when our State Department's lips are moving, that's how you know it's lying. Mm-hmm. And so I will and also I'm probably a lot older than you. Okay. So I remember like everything from even before weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Now I get there are probably people in Ukraine that want the support. I get that. And I understand. That's unfortunate, that they're in this predicament. But the reality is, my understanding is that there were agreements that were made within that region that were not held to and not held, like people were not accountable for. And there's a lot of people within the eastern part of Ukraine that are very malcontent. And they have their own issues. That's not anything that had to do with Russia invading. Now, Russia, I think, has been clear about what they want. Now, going and being hyperbolic, like they're trying to take out Ukraine, they're trying to get all of Ukraine. No, they're not invading Russia. I mean, they're not invading Poland. They were very specific. And I just think, as somebody who is not an expert on this by any stretch, and we've had on people to talk about this, like we've had on military people, we've had on different people to talk about it. Medea Benjamin, whose book I read about this, which was very, very informative. She goes back.
Think it's a really bad book, but we can disagree about that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, so I understand that I do not know enough about this, but I do know, again, that when people are asking for aid, it's not going where it needs to go. And the people that are making the money are not it's not helping the Ukrainian people. It just isn't. Okay. And I also haven't heard of or seen any that strategy. No, but when we've had people talking about what is their end strategy? What is their plan? And they don't seem to have one.
There's a few things I wanted to talk about here. As for the idea that when the State Department talks, it's lying. I remember this logic used at the start of the invasion by a lot of commentators to dismiss concerns that were brought up by the American State Department that the Russians were going to invade in the first place. The American government was the first government to publicly say the Russians are preparing, our intelligence says so, they're gathering troops on the border. Even the Ukrainian government, I think to some extent, didn't even want to believe it because of what that could mean for the future of their country. But the American State Department was right. Their intelligence assessments were right.
Why do you think they were right?
I think it's because that their signals intelligence is quite good in Russia. They're on persons and they're on the ground intelligence, so it's a little bit more shoddy. I think that's part of the reason why they didn't predict the outcome of what would happen when Russia invaded. Didn't know how.
Do you think that we have any sort of responsibility regarding any sort of provocation for any of this with us, with NATO, with any of that? Do we have any responsibility?
I think slight, but I don't think that was a major contributor to the war. The
I
fact
don't think that was necessarily a contributor. I think they had a specific mission, Putin, and they had a specific mission what they were going to accomplish. I do think that the whole concept of NATO up their ass is definitely inflammatory. But I do think that.
Can I comment on something earlier you said I wanted to talk about like the aid not going to the people who need it? So I was in the Russian speakers. I've been to Eastern Ukraine. I've been to the Donetsk region. I've been to Zaporozhye. My first ever forward operating position I went to, it was with Russian-speaking territorial defense. What I found in my time in Eastern Ukraine is the vast majority of people who speak Russian that I met, now, of course, this is my experience, and this is from my perspective, don't view the Russians very favorably. In fact, many of the aid workers that are most diehard aid workers I know used to view the Russians more favorably. And then after the invasion started, that kinship and brotherhood that they thought they felt kind of collapsed in on itself. I'm making a documentary about a friend of mine named Dima who was sent to Russian-speaking school because his mom wanted him to go to Moscow because Moscow is the financial capital of this part of the world, and Moscow was going to give him all the opportunities. And he spent the opening months of the war evacuating civilians out of Mariupol as the Russians shelled the city and killed between 35 to 75,000 people. And so I think that the Russian-speaking narrative, if we were to imply it in any other country or put it in any other country, the dynamics would change. If we were to say, oh, well, the Irish speak English, so obviously that means their deep cultural ties to England are so deep that they want to.
I don't think that.
I'm not saying I'm not saying you think that. What I just want to put forward is we don't have any solid evidence that in the regions where Russia invaded, the majority of that population wanted to necessarily be part of Russia. There certainly is a Soviet, definitely a nostalgic Soviet era part of the population, because there's a very old population, both Russia and Ukraine, because they had a demographic collapse after the Soviet Union, who have a kind of, nostalgia for the Soviet Union, that time of stability before the collapse. But it's that support, in my experience, was not widespread. That's also probably due to the fact that most of the people in that region that I was talking to are definitely people who are more involved in resistance. But I think I only met one person I've been in Ukraine for 2 years now, covering the war basically nonstop. I've only met one person who was a waiter in, I think, Chasiv Yar, who had real support for the Russians.
I appreciate all of that. I really do. But I go to, so what's our role in it?
I think our role is to fulfill the commitment.
Forever?
I think our goal is to finance them to have the best position, either to regain their country or when negotiations eventually happen, because all wars end with negotiation, to give them the best position to negotiate. Negotiating with the Russians, especially considering their track record, it's going to be necessary for the Ukrainians to have good leverage. And that's going to mean they have the ability to continue to defend themselves. If they don't, the Russians will take advantage of it, like they did in 2014, like they did in Moldova in the 1990s, like they did in Chechnya, like they did in Georgia. They have this tendency of freezing conflicts and then reigniting them when it's at their best advantage, when they've rebuilt their forces and when the West is distracted. So let's say, for example, there was a war between China and Taiwan, and we signed a ceasefire tomorrow in Ukraine. The West might be distracted with that. And during that opportunity, Russia takes advantage to then push that war again. And this isn't far off scenarios. This is what happened in Ukraine in 2022, because the war originally started back in 2014.
Do you agree with friend of the show, Willie Bragg, 2014 is when the war started due to the CIA's toppling the government?
No, I think that's a bunch of horse hockey. I've talked to a lot of Euromaidan protesters. I looked at the evidence. I looked at the Victoria Nuland phone call and listened to it. And I thought the Victoria Nuland phone call, which is supposed to be the smoking gun for this theory, it pushed me in the opposite direction. It made me more positive that we did not motivate the government and tried to push the protesters to overthrow Yanukovych. Because in that phone call, they say pretty explicitly, we want the protesters to accept the deal offered by Klitschko. Klitschko was negotiating with the Yanukovych regime, and he found a deal to have elections 6, 7, 8 months down the line while keeping Yanukovych in power. The protesters didn't trust it because after the murder of 100 protesters and him trying to outlaw protesting, they were scared that he was going to use that time in order to consolidate power. But the West thought that was the best deal that they were going to get, so they pushed the protesters to accept the deal. The deal looked at the West and basically said, screw you, kept protesting, and eventually they kicked Yanukovych out of the country. So it doesn't make sense for me for it being a CIA coup if the American government officials in these leaked calls were asking for the exact opposite thing to happen because they were fearful of, instability or the Russians using it as a justification to invade, which they ultimately did.
So with that said,
can I say one more? I'm sorry to do one more comment, but I want to talk about defense procurement.
To me, it just all comes down. The bottom line is, it just comes down to, even if everything, I will stipulate everything you're saying, and I still just don't see where this goes. And there doesn't, and military people have commented, like, it's just not going anywhere. So, and they're not NATO.
Necessarily agree with that assessment, but about defense production, I was with the artillery crews that were using American cluster munitions, American M777 unitary shells. They treat that equipment like gold, because they know they don't have a lot of it. And most of their contemporaries, they have old Soviet 50, 60, 70-year-old guns that have been worn out with time, firing thousands and thousands of shells from the war in the Donbass. And so in my experience, when it comes to military aid, we have yet to find any real hard evidence. And this is both agreed to by both parties, even after appointing the Inspector General, they have yet to find any misattribution of funds when it comes to military aid. The real corruption stories in Ukraine, and this is why I have a problem with how sometimes aid is talked about, because when people talk about corruption in Ukraine, the image they have is almost comical, that we send over the tanks and then they're all going to be like sent to some terror group, or we send over these important cluster shells, and the Ukrainian government, when they need them to defend themselves, they're going to send them to all these terror groups. Real corruption in Ukraine is contracts, government contracts, where a buddy in the Ukrainian government gives another buddy through a shell company contracts for production of goods that they don't have experience in, and so they whittle all that money down, don't spend it effectively, and then enrich themselves. That's what happened in some of the rebuilding efforts in Bucha. That's what happened with I think some military jackets funds from the Ukrainian budget. But when it comes to American military aid, that stuff is watched pretty carefully, and I don't think that those funds are being misallocated. At least I don't have any evidence of it. If you do, I'd love to hear about it.
Here's the evidence that I need, and it's the only evidence I ever care about.
Okay.
If these multinational corporations, whether it is, you take your pick, if Lockheed Martin is involved, if Raytheon is involved, if General Dynamics is involved, and I'm only using them on the surface. I go much deeper into this. Again, I wasn't prepared to have a debate about
one of these other companies. Yeah,
sure.
Any of them.
Point being is that their primary objective is to make money. And if the objective is to keep this going as long as humanly possible, if that means that they are in bed with, again, whether it's the Swiss banks, whether it's even, the banks in Ukraine, frankly, whether it's even banks in Russia, the goal is to always keep this going. Now, how much is true about how much of a say Boris Johnson actually had or could have essentially ended this thing within the first few weeks, and they said, no, this is not happening. We're going to win, whatever the fuck that means.
Right.
This is where we have, when I lived through Iraq and knowing what that was, and no two wars are the same. I understand that. But when you look at how that quagmire was something that never needed to happen in the first place.
Neither did this.
And this is something that will just go and go and go. And it's the little things, Dylan. It's the little things that come along. I don't give a flying F about, the people who want to play off this. Oh, it's the Azov battalion, and that's why these guys are fighting. We got to get rid of the Nazis. It's this whole. No, I want to know what the actual deal is here. And the way I see it from the outside looking in, blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline was a big fucking dumb move. And on top of that, you have so much rich resources in Ukraine, whether it's, I believe, wheat is a huge part of this. Cobalt, I believe, in terms of a natural mineral, is a huge one as well. Most of these fights, from my observation, always comes down to dollars and cents. The longer a war goes, the more money that is made and the more people that are killed.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.